Okay, welcome back from break, everyone. I hope you all were able to connect with one another and have some good conversations, which can also continue after the symposium. I'm pleased to welcome to our stage our second panel, and I'll be introducing the moderator, who is Nicole Benham. She is the Senior Orphans and Vulnerable Children Advisor at PEPFAR in OGAC, and she will be introducing our panelists. So welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here. It's so wonderful, actually, to be a part of this panel because it's something that's very close to my heart. And this panel is going to be about how social service workers support and equip community members engaged in child protection. And as Mike knows, we've had many, many conversations about this in the past. And for us, I think it's a very, very important part of the work that we discuss quite a bit, but that often gets overlooked in implementation. Although I was delighted to see in the last panel how much of that was really happening at the community level as well. You know, we know, I'm not going to say much here because I really want to get right into the presentations, but we do know that it's really at the community level that things happen or don't happen. The community can either be a doorway to a response that brings healing and hope for children, or it can be a bottleneck that either ignores what's happened to children or even promotes a response that's very unhealthy and unsafe for children. And so it's a part of this whole system strengthening. We often go towards the formal. We think about the very formal systems. We forget about what happens informally all the time. And this is something that I know Mike is going to talk a lot about as well. But actually, I should introduce the panelists. This is Dr. Mike Wessels, who's a professor at Columbia University and so much more than that. So please do read his bio. And also, we've got Mr. Patrick Onyango Mangen, who is the country director of TPO in Uganda. And we're going to have some brief presentations from them about between 10 and 12 minutes. And then we really wanted to have some a good amount of time for questions and real dialogue. So we'll come back to that. But in the meantime, I'd like you to help me welcome to the podium Dr. Mike Wessels.
Thanks very much, Nicole. It is a real pleasure to be with you this morning. I feel like we're having a dialogue across different tribes and different disciplines. So I'm a lifelong worker in the field of child protection and have spent most of my adult years, or quasi-adult years as they may be, working in large-scale emergencies, typically settings of armed conflict. But I think that some of the lessons are relevant, and so I'll try to share some of those with you. I was asked to talk a little bit about how do we go about preparing a workforce to actually support the good work that communities already do to protect children. As Susan said this morning, and as Nicole pointed out, it is families and communities who do the lion's share of work. They are the ports of first call, and they're the people who do the heavy lifting with regard to child protection. So when we think about strengthening child protection systems, building a workforce, we have to think about supporting what communities already do. But we need a little bit of humility when we take this topic on because, first of all, there's a very weak evidence base regarding community-based child protection mechanisms. We know a bit more about the things that NGOs and governments do, but what do we know about the endogenous mechanisms, the sort of spontaneous, homegrown sort of efforts that are very sustainable and often quite effective? You have to excuse me, the pollen is affecting me this morning. That means that there's also there's a corresponding paucity of evidence regarding who actually supports those community-based child protection mechanisms. We tend to focus on professional social workers or on paraprofessionals, which of course are hugely important. What about the religious leaders? What about the youth workers? What about the grannies who oftentimes do a lot of work not only on behalf of children directly, but on behalf of community mechanisms? What do we mean when we talk about community-based child protection mechanisms? Basically, we mean formal or non-formal groups that work at a grassroots level to monitor, respond to, and prevent child protection issues. On the more formal side, governments or NGOs may set up child protection committees or child welfare committees, groups of maybe 10 or 15 people, adults and maybe some teenagers, who are selected precisely for their ability to monitor and respond to various kinds of threats to children, whether it be violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, and so on. But there are also endogenous mechanisms. And I would say that as child protection workers, we have not always, and I include myself in this, we have not always done a good job of listening and to local communities and learning what's already there. What are their challenges? How do they understand who are children? How do they understand what are harms to children? What do they do in response? So traditional courts of justice, faith-based groups who form to help children affected by HIV and AIDS, they may not even use the term child protection. They may not view themselves as any kind of formal workers, but their support is absolutely crucial. These endogenous groups are profoundly important, but I think it's also important not to romanticize and to recognize that sometimes they embody local norms that are a mixture of positive assets to support children and sometimes include harmful traditional practices. So we have to keep a critical eye out. Several years back, I had the honor of leading on behalf of the Interagency Learning Initiative, which is a coalition of about 20 NGOs and donors and government agencies trying to strengthen community-based child protection mechanisms. We did a review of the effectiveness of community-based child protection mechanisms, and we found a horribly weak evidence base. But for the evidence that was there, we were able to discern on a provisional basis 7 effectiveness factors that contributed to effectiveness and sustainability. And it won't surprise you that the number one factor was community ownership. To the extent that communities said, this group is ours, this is our mechanism for fulfilling our responsibility and our obligation to our children, that led communities to pour themselves into the work of that group and to find ways to make them effective. And they were oftentimes done without funding and were really quite sustainable. These other factors we can come back to maybe in the discussion, but as a footnote, we were able to analyze the extent of community ownership that was generally achieved by NGO-led efforts to form child protection committees. And what we found generally was low to moderate levels of community ownership. At the end of the day, most people said, oh yeah, that's a UNICEF project. That's a Save the Children project. And so they didn't take it as their own. And there's a big loss as a result. Well, I wanted to suggest that when we think about the role of service workers, we need to think about the non-formal actors as well as the formal actors. And at the broadest level, I think we can think about the importance of supporting what community mechanisms already do. That means we have to map them and have to know what they are. And that is very seldom done. It means identifying and supporting natural helpers, engaging in some deep listening and learning about social problems, their root causes, and about the local assets and resources. Who do people naturally go to for help? If there are workers on a faith-based committee to help people affected by HIV and AIDS, who supports those workers? These are questions that haven't been asked quite enough. The importance of accompanying and supporting the community is crucial. Oftentimes, workers are viewed as experts who are somehow positioned above the community. This gets it all wrong. There needs to be a process of being one of the people and actually helping communities do what they already do, only more effectively. We need a stronger emphasis on prevention and resilience, because so much work in child protection has had a responsive focus, which of course is important, but we can't afford to sit back and wait for the horrible things to happen and then try to pick up the pieces later. There's a lot of education and capacity building, but I'm going to argue that this should not be necessarily in a top-down modality. It ought to be in a more respectful lateral process. And the workforce needs to have a leg in two worlds: the world of child rights and modernity, and the other leg needs to be where local people live, with traditional understandings, with local beliefs and practices, and they need to be able to navigate that world and to find a way to negotiate and to make an appropriate balance between them so that we align the formal and the non-formal. And then where harmful practices exist in communities and families, we need to think about social norms change. UNICEF and some other agencies have pioneered a methodology for changing harmful traditional practices, not by black letter law, not by imposition, but by finding the internal change agents, feeding them information, enabling them to expand their networks, to identify alternatives that are positive to practices such as female genital mutilation and cutting, and then developing and promoting those more helpful alternatives. Most workers are not trained to do this kind of thing, and the international funding often works against us because funding that's given in short tranches does not achieve long-term social change, which is often measured in blocks of 5 years, 5, 10, or 20 years or longer. In Sierra Leone, I'm involved in some action research with communities in which we started with ethnography. Communities identified what they saw as the biggest harms to children. And they didn't say things like female genital mutilation, which is very widespread in Sierra Leone. They said things like teenage pregnancy. And it turns out that teenage pregnancy, about a third of them stem from sexual abuse and exploitation. Communities themselves, meaning youth, girls, boys, men, women, leaders, and in a very inclusive process, chose to address that problem through Marie Stopes, after all, is Sierra Leonean, family planning, sexual and reproductive health, and life skills, and all done in a very community-driven modality. We literally don't have a manualized kind of approach. It is something that is done using the vigor and creativity of youth groups who go out and do dramas and do lead discussion groups and peer educators who advise on a daily level. But some of the changes we're seeing are really quite dramatic. Health workers at the health post said that before this, they were never invited into communities. So the uptake was low. And I would say that as an enterprise, strengthening the workforce has too often been characterized by high on capacity building, low on uptake. We need to turn that around. The uptake was the big impact that has been achieved so far. Now the community health workers are seen as people who help the community solve its problems. They're invited into the community. They're treated even with an element of reverence and a lot of respect. So if we create a community-driven approach, I think we get much farther with regard to the utilization of services. But what this means is if we need to rethink the orientation, the skills, the attitudes and behaviors of the workforce. So oftentimes there's been an emphasis, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, on training people to be quite expert at case-based management, which of course is a very important piece of government-led work. But typically the social workers view themselves as positioned above the people somehow. Oftentimes people are office-centered. They don't spend much time in the community. When you ask people in an unprejudiced manner what they think of government social workers, they'll say, well, those guys that come out here, they are not one of us, and they use too many resources. They eat our food, they stay in our places, and they really, at the end of the day, are not seen as helping very much. Where NGOs come in and try to help with some social workers, they oftentimes engage in facilitation, but it's a rapid facilitation of social change, a sort of facilitation. And I would argue that there's too much imposition that's going on. What we need is a cadre of workers, including non-formal workers, who are co-learners, one of the people, who engage in real power sharing, who do psychosocial support, not because they're trained counselors, but because they're empathic and respectful. They're prevention-oriented. And they're concerned with community outreach and supporting the non-formal. And where there are harmful practices, they are agents of social change. And they take the slow, patient approach to facilitation. This is hard, hard work. And so I think it requires a different approach. And to do this work, I think it requires a highly reflective orientation. It's not just about being an expert. You've got to think of power. How am I positioned relative to local people? Is it really about the well-being and the activities of children and families, or is it about the number of cases that I have and the the number of referrals that I'm making and the interventions that I'm doing. At the end of the day, the next generation of workers could have a much bigger impact if instead of focusing quite so much on cases and what they're doing directly to help children, if they focused on helping the natural helpers, helping the community groups that are already there. That's not to say they should abandon their casework. That's going to continue to be enormously important, but there needs to be a better balance struck. If we do this, then I think at the end of the day, we'll be in a much better position to fulfill our obligations to helping the world's children. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. That's great. And so now we'd like to hear from Mr. Patrick Onyango-Mengen from TPO.
Good morning to you all. I was asked to share some of our experiences on how we have worked with local community groups as well as individuals and built their capacity to care and protect children. So I'll be sharing with you some examples from the field. And the first example is from Somalia. So with support from UNICEF, for over 6 years, we worked with selected local community groups, some of those similar to what Mike has been describing, to deliver child protection and psychosocial support services. The context of Somalia, as many of you know, is a very complex, hard-to-work-in context. And I just give you some examples there. It's one of active conflict, widespread civil disorder, inexistent social service delivery structures, gross rights violations on women and children, and a very strong, closely knitted and influential clan system. So our task was then to identify and build capacity of 12 grassroots organizations, which were not formal at all, loosely organized youth groups, women groups. And the interventions we came up with was, first of all, to map individuals within communities, associations and informal groups involved in child care of whatever form. The criteria wasn't any basic qualifications. We're looking at people who were empathetic, people who were willing to help, and who had volunteered before. And the approach, therefore, we selected over 20 individuals that had been recommended by communities and vetted during the mapping as credible. And then we also identified 50 trainees affiliated to community self-help groups. These could have been secretaries of the groups or the individual that started the group. Some of them were local CBOs, and we identified these for training. So we brought about 70 of them to Uganda for an intensive 3-week field-based training, sharing the Uganda experience in the north, working with children, psychosocial care and support. From this group, we selected 32 that were capable of training others as community facilitators. And from this group, we looked out for those that had leadership skills to be able to manage local CBOs. The minimum criteria for this was slightly higher up, knowledge of basic writing skills, English, and completion of secondary level education. And so the 32 were further trained as trainers. The training took a cascading approach. 8 dropped out of the course, and 30 were retained as caregivers. These were then attached to local CBOs, and where CBOs did not exist, we encouraged them to come together as a group, and then they decided to form these CBOs. So in all, we ended up with 12 CBOs, which were formally incorporated. Working with UNICEF, we started extending sub-grants to these CBOs, ranging from $25,000 to $50,000 a year, or over a 2-year period. So sub-granting included project administration, financial capacity building, and we moved out after 5 years. And before I came here, I've been in touch with about 8 of these CBOs. The rest probably dropped out or went into different things, and many of them are still continuing with this work. The curriculum and training materials we used were non-accredited psychosocial and child protection training materials that were largely adapted from the Ugandan context. The second case example then is still a very hard to reach, hard to work in community in Uganda. This is a semi-arid community. They're normally nomadic pastoralists. You hardly get many NGOs and foreign staff working in Karamoja. There are 2 doctors and 3 social workers for over 30,000 people, and widespread harmful traditional practices. Again, our task, building on our Somalia experience, was to establish a community-driven child protection system, building capacity of parasocial workers and supporting them to form CBOs. Probably different here is we're not targeting individuals, because you target individuals, then they go into different things. So we're looking at small entities that could begin the process of forming social capital that is more sustainable within these communities. The curricula this time was quite different from what we used in Somalia. We had learned from the Somalia experience, and this time we teamed up with REPC and worked with them to introduce a distance learning course for children and youth, which is accredited to the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I think this was mentioned before. And here, this is just a picture that shows you the kind of environment these groups work in. They meet regularly, they plan together, and they discuss their action plans. This is a quotation from one of the alumni who trained. The training is about 18 months. Half of that is probably field-based, and all the modules, the 6 modules, are all distance delivered through distance learning. And Francis here, he just says, first of all, I never had an opportunity for an education. The knowledge gained from the course enabled me to get the job at the hospital as a child caregiver in the social services department. Now I also do community health education, communicate with the children and parents who come to the hospital about parenting skills and care for OVC. And he also raises awareness on the needs of children. These are some of the clan leaders interacting with the trainees, and you can see the environment in which they reach. It's very, very hard to reach, extremely remote and traditionally managed. And a CBO is formed bottom-up from this example. And Rhoda, who is also one of the alumni, together with 4 other colleagues, formed a women's NGO called Maendeleo Women's Group in Karamoja. And she had this to say about the cause. I only possessed a secondary level education, but had always wanted to help children in my community. This course gave me the opportunity to do that. After the course, we formed our own CBO, which TPO helped us register. We now have a constitution, we opened up a bank account, and manage small grants from TPO, from ZOA, and many other agencies coming to us for community work. And so we took our experiences from these trainings, which were not accredited, and together with the CPC network, we embarked on an interagency process of developing a professional child protection course unit in Uganda. And this 3-year process drew participation from academia, practitioners, and government policymakers. The main aim was we had recognized that working with the community groups, the community caregivers, the loosely formed networks of these community groups, we could work with them closely to bring the services in areas which were inaccessible. However, the training had to be of a certain level. Some of the materials we're using were not accredited. And therefore, we developed a prototype child protection course unit, which was later accredited by the local Ministry of Gender and 3 public universities in Uganda, including Makerere, Chambogo, and Nsamizi. This course unit was then split into 3 levels, all targeting specific student populations. The first integrated the course unit as an elective into a social work degree program, targeting entry-level social workers. The second integrated the course unit, again, as an elective for the master's degree in social sector planning and management, targeting policymakers. And then the third was an in-service training course, targeting professionals already working in government and the private sector. Whereas the first 2 were integrated into 3 existing university programs, it came at no extra cost. Initially, we thought and said, well, should we form a standalone child protection course? But then you need to popularize it, you need to market it, and it comes at extra fees. So integrating within an existing program seemed very cost-effective for us. To date, the course has now trained 3 student cohorts, so far targeting over 300 students and policymakers each year. And these materials have then been adapted to train community-based caregivers under the PEPFAR-supported projects, the OVC Sunrise project and the SCORE program. For example, Sunrise adopted these materials and has so far trained 1,300 community development officers and close to 2,000 parasocial workers. The CDOs in turn supervise the parasocial workers, and while SCOA has used these materials to train close to 200 community-based caregivers supporting vulnerable children. The training is for 2 weeks classroom and 1 week field placement, and the certificate is now issued by local universities. The pitfalls have been spoken about. I don't want to go through those. I think Linsk and the others have talked about those. There's a need for regular support supervision. Like Mike said, you need a balance between what we look at as the rights approach and what the communities traditionally practice. Regular supervision is very critical, but also working with informal community structures probably is more effective where you have referral networks, because their capacities are limited. There are certain cases they cannot handle which need to be referred. But what they do well is follow-up and so on. And then refresher training and orienting them periodically on new practices and the laws and what regulations are out there. And lastly, trainee selection has to be detailed, taking into consideration character, voluntarism, and empathy, but also looking at issues of do no harm and working to ensure the best interests of the child. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. As you can see, we have very punctual presenters. So we have some good amount of time now, I think, for Q&A. I want to open it up for questions. And also, just to remind you, we really do want this to be dialogical, but we also would like it to stay to questions and not long commentary so that we can get a lot of questions in the amount of time that we have. I don't know if we have any also from the webcast, so please just let me know if there are any. So I'd like to open it up. Go right to Gretchen.
Thanks. Not that I need it, but so I'm Gretchen Bachman, and I work at USAID on the PEPFAR project. And for both the presenters, but picking up on something, Mike, that you were talking about, you said that about 1/3 of the cases of teenage pregnancy you suspected were forced. And but the community response thus far has been reproductive health services and counseling and life skills, which is wonderful, but to me doesn't necessarily, you know, I can talk all I want, but that doesn't protect me as a young girl. So how is the community looking at those situations where, you know, those things aren't going to help?
Thank you, Gretchen, for that question. When we do community-driven work, we are faced with a lot of challenges like this. As a child protection worker, I'm trained to jump in and to say, no, you've got to stop that abuse now. But it doesn't produce any real community ownership. I found myself biting my tongue and being really afraid that they would not take on the abuse. In fact, they took on the abuse, but they had the presence of mind and the understanding not to start with that. Why? Because the abuse was committed mostly by men my age in positions of power. And to confront them head on would be to make your life worse and more dangerous. And so if I could give one example, when we fed information from the ethnography back to the communities, community said, you got it right, you know, it was some degree of validation. And then they asked, what are we going to do about it? And in one village, they decided to pass a bylaw. And I have had a lot of doubts about bylaws because so often they're not enforced. But in this case, this particular community went around and every family said, our girls are being abused. And it's often by older men and even by teachers. And they said, this needs to stop. And the chief went around and asked the head of each family to personally sign on in public, sign on verbally. So about 2 months ago, a 55-year-old man abused a 15-year-old girl in that village. And following the usual custom, the perpetrator walked over to the chief's house with animals in tow, cash in hand. You know, this is the way it was traditionally done. And the chief refused to talk with him. The man brought his brothers over. And following a cultural script I hadn't even known about, excuse me, they wailed. They groveled in the dirt. They demonstrated profound apology and subjugation. But at the end of 3 days, The chief came out on his veranda and said, your family was there the day we, as a village and every family, agreed that this has to end. You're going to the chiefdom jail for 2 years. Now, the child protection worker in me says, well, that's just a slap on the hand. But this was something that had never happened in anyone's living memory. And it was a process of community change and community ownership. So I think, I don't want to claim that it's always going to go this way, but I think that there's a process of trust and learning about how people on the inside will take on these issues. And I would say that if they had taken my approach of saying, take on that sexual exploitation, they wouldn't have gotten anywhere near that far. So I think we need to just try to document, try to encourage, and then take these learnings and share them laterally. So a lot of what we're going to be doing over the next months and years is helping these communities that have transformed themselves share with other communities. And because there's always the question of how do you scale this up? But Sierra Leone is a good example of a country that is scaling up. They have a new child and family welfare policy that is taking this issue of community ownership seriously. And my view is that communities are the best teachers of us. Why shouldn't they teach each other and learn from each other? So that I think that this is the way it will go. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions from the audience or from online? While we're waiting, I just, and please do, question, comment. I did want to mention what I like about both of your presentations is the emphasis on the humility and the co-learning, because I think, and again, also as a child protection worker, it's very, very difficult to hold back when you see that kind of thing happening. And yet, if we really want these things to be sustained and be effective in the short and the long term, we need that co-learning, we need that humility and patience. Certainly there are certain situations where you have to jump in for the safety of the child and do something, but that sort of meeting of the minds that has to happen. And I think Sierra Leone, and again, also Somalia and Karamoja, I mean, you guys have picked some of the most difficult places with some of the deepest child protection issues to highlight. So I mean, way to go to like take a deep dive here. I'm really, like, you didn't start with the easy stuff. So, so please, more questions, but if not, I'd also like you to talk a little bit more about the research that you're working on.
Sure.
Are there any other questions before we go there? Because we really wanted to make sure there was time.
Sorry, I know I'm a question hog. I would love for you guys to talk about, because we had. Oh, sorry. I was
You're
gonna
loud,
try
but you're
and
not that
sneak
loud.
it in. I was going to try and sneak it in, but no, I think it would be really helpful because, earlier we were hearing about all these programs to train social workers. And from what you're talking about, that acceptance at the community level and how do we get within the trained workforce that understanding of the community mobilization and role. And so I would love to hear from both of you, and especially from Patrick, how you're crossing that bridge between informal and formal, traditional and formal systems, and how can we do that better?
Thank you. And those are challenges we face very often in doing this kind of work. And in many ways, we find the formal sector, they don't entirely appreciate the role of the informal sector. So that's a starting point, getting them to realize that the youth groups, the women's group, the informal groups actually do a lot of work. These are the ones who do the day-to-day contact. They do home-based care, but they also do referral. So one of the entry points we're trying to, promote is let each of them do their own piece, and let the informal sector not, make like they are able to do the work of a medical assistant at the village level, but let them collaborate through referrals, through follow-up, through community-based education, but also sharing their understanding of the local context and cultural practices. As far as the training is concerned, I think it was in Dr. Linsky's presentation about the career ladder, and I see difficulties, as far as getting these informal trainees to ascend that ladder, because those qualifications are not recognized within the university system. So some of the courses we've developed for the formal in-house training courses are really targeting those with basic education that can then upgrade. And yes, of course, there are some cases where the informal trainees have gone on and embarked on, but it's long-term study. I mean, this certificate course alone is 18 months. You would probably do 2 postgraduates within that time, but it takes a long time, and it's a bit, very expensive for them to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, just to chime in a bit, I think many times the workers who are hired do not live in the actual community. To be of the people is really, really crucial. And I'm not opposed to the idea of social workers, and others and paraprofessionals coming in, but at some level what we really want, I think, is immediate access. And as Patrick says, this ability to navigate dual worlds. And I think that without living there, people won't have the respect for the local tradition. So let me be critical for just a moment. People like us who are university trained and people in country who are relatively well educated oftentimes harbor fairly deep prejudices against traditional beliefs and practices. They are literally more Western than we are. And they oftentimes aspire to science, which has a tremendous amount of prestige. And of course, I mean, we think it's wonderful, but sometimes it's seen as a cure-all when there's a lot of basic human compassion that does not have to be driven by science. Science can support it in certain ways. So I guess what I'm saying is that oftentimes we create a workforce of outsiders who are not sufficiently informed by local traditions, nor do they feel comfortable in that world. And they're certainly not accepted by it. And so the end result is that they're poorly positioned to be social change agents. And they end up engaging in what I would call impositional behavior. You come in with a child rights agenda, you teach people that they have their rights, and I've spent most of my life promoting child rights. I'm not at all an opponent of child rights. But in Sierra Leone, what we found, we just simply asked people, what are the biggest harms to children? One of the top harms to children was identified as child rights. They said child rights are stripping us of our ability to be good parents because children had been taught you shouldn't be beaten. So when you get beaten, you report that person to the human rights worker. And then the parents, there are documented cases where parents said, well, maybe this child who's reported me to the police should go with the police, should live with the police. So from a child protection standpoint, it's the worst outcome imaginable. So the way in which we do our capacity building and the way in which we seed communities with outsiders, I would say is not the best approach. And when it's used, when we've over-relied on it. So I think we heard this morning, in the previous panel, and what Patrick is talking about, is finding people on the inside, capacitating them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these are going to be people who are going to earn university degrees, but they'll become more sophisticated, and they can learn from each other. But we need a different approach that's less didactic, less top-down, far more practical, and above all, respectful of local culture without romanticizing it. And I think if we do those things, we will transform, literally, the impact that we have.
Can I just make one more comment on that to plug again the deep listening that you talk about that I think we just often don't have time for. We work in a project-based world, and yet we are, all of us in this room, influential in our own spheres. And I'm not sure that's going to change anytime soon. So for example, with the Sierra Leone case, I know that one of the reasons why the parents would abdicate responsibility because of the child rights was that the child had violated their obligation and their in the Sierra Leonean way of thinking, it was that, to be a child of mine, you fulfill these roles. Now you violated that, and I have no more obligation to you. And I know that that sounds cold and calloused, and it's not quite that simple, but that is a big part of understanding what the norms are locally. And when the child rights wedge was sort of driven between parents and children, we actually ended up creating child protection concerns in some cases. And so that deep listening and understanding, I think, is very, very important, and something we often don't feel like we have time for. But I think then we kind of go in and out, and then we leave, and we don't even know the kind of harms that have been left behind. So, but I'll stop talking. Okay, can we have one more question or comment, Adriana? Oh, sorry. Were there people over here waiting? Oh, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, I'm hiding. My name is Mathilde. I work for UNICEF in New York. But my question is on a previous experience. Okay, we have to report to donors, and we're very accountable on results. And we experienced that working with communities, they were like child protection communities. It was people who hardly knew how to write. And it was a huge challenge to get them to report. And they were doing a great job, but it was, just highlighting it, which was an issue. I was wondering if you had any comments on how to move forward on that.
Yeah. Just quickly, in the work we do, what I was sharing is when we work with the volunteers and informal groups, we don't expect them to report at all. We don't even give them notebooks and say every month send us a report of what you're doing. However, the supervision structure is very critical. We would then have a social worker who goes in and engages with them through community conversations in the local setting and picks out issues of interest. Yes, some information could, drop through along the way, but we feel by asking them to report, then you're doing exactly what Mike was saying. As an external person, you're saying this is, an NGO volunteer. This is an NGO, so on. So, yeah. So we don't normally ask them to report, and we, based on the social workers, to pick out the information they require.
One way, one way we've tried to manage is to embed in the communities monitors. And the monitors do participant observation. They live in the community. They go to schools. They go to places of worship. They do farming with local people. But they observe what's happening, and then they can prepare the reports. So I think that taking the burden, as Patrick says, off people who have low levels of literacy, and for whom, the world of reports is, that's a whole different system. It's the art of this work, I think, is keeping it about them, about what local people do, and finding some alternate way of getting the information we need to navigate our world.
Well, I'm sorry that we don't have more time to discuss. We thought we'd left a lot of time. I'm sorry for people who didn't get their questions, and please do come and talk to Mike and Patrick, because I think they have a lot more where that came from. So thank you all very much, and we'll move on to the next panel.
Thank you so much, Mike, Nicole, and Patrick. I feel like I could listen to all of you all day. It's such a shame that we have to move on, but we have another great panel of speakers.